Down in this van, part 7, as you can see, I'm sat in a car. My van is otherwise indisposed, so this will have to do. Today I'm going to talk about recording equipment and a little bit about the recording process. You can see a complete recording process that I've done. The link is in the description box below. And there's two different methods, the analog-ish way and the computer way. So I thought it prudent to start with a little bit of a historical aspect of recording. For my own purposes, 30 years ago, I had a 4-track cassette recorder, and it was awesome. It was one of the best things that I was ever given, because it made me listen. Not only was it great fun to be able to play over the top of something that you'd already recorded, it made me listen very, very carefully to the parts that I was in fact putting down. Now, that is, lots of kids now, or anyone under 30 really, will go, well, but you need this, you need that, you need all these tracks to be able to do this, that and the other. And well, yeah, okay, yes, I suppose you do. But actually, I think it's harder for young musicians now with all of this equipment, because they're thinking, well, what do I do with it? How do I get the sound I want? And there's an awful lot at the moment in computer recording terms where people sort of stab in the dark a bit. They go, well, let's record those and see if they work at the end. And that can be a massive waste of your time, because you get to the other end and you start. One thing that happened to me when I got the computer is I started getting a little bit happy with the fact that there were essentially infinite tracks, only limited by the RAM of the computer. So I was just recording lots of parts and trying to play them back and thinking, this is a row. This is just a mess. What am I doing? And it was just because the tracks were there, and I was just thinking, let's record some more guitar parts. I'm going to do some chords and some this, and going to have a different amp on this track and all of this. And actually, the main difference for me, the main benefit of a computer-based system was the fact that you could have all of your effects built in. You didn't have to buy all these reverb units, and you could also store the mix. So you didn't have to recall it the next time round and push the faders up to the values that you'd noted down on a piece of paper, for example. Now, if we go back further, if we go back to the mid-60s, it's way before I was born, we had Brian Wilson recording Pet Sounds, and the Beatles pretty much at the same time doing Sgt. Pepper. Now, those records were made using 4-track machines. When you listen to them, and well, actually there was an 8-track machine involved in Pet Sounds as well at the end. More of that in a minute. And you have all these sounds and all these soundscapes and this wonderful music coming off those records. You think, well, how did they do it? The answer is that there was an awful lot of rehearsing involved and an awful lot of thinking about how they were going to use the limited tracks or the limited technology that they had at the time. If you play Are You Experienced, if you listen to it on CD through headphones, the recording quality is actually not very good at all. It's mostly because the tapes are falling to pieces, the original master tapes, and the limitations of what they had does come out in the recordings. But let's face it, you could record Jimi Hendrix on a computer cassette recorder or a dictaphone, and it would still sound great, because of who he was, because of the quality of the music that was coming out. And that obviously goes for those other people as well, the Beatles and the Beach Boys and et al. Now, after my 4-track had broken, unfortunately, that was a sad day. It's just plastic parts. They do that. They fall to bits. Before I could afford my 8-track machine, which I bought second-hand, my brother, who's a professional musician as well, he's a drummer, bass player, keyboard player, singer. We used to record using 2 stereo machines, and we had a stereo cassette recorder, which had the Dolby HX Pro extension. That'll mean nothing to anyone under 30, but essentially it made it better. And I also had a DAT recorder, a DAT machine, a digital audio tape machine. This was back in the sort of early 90s. And it was amazing because suddenly we had the quality that wasn't really there with the 4-track, but coupled with less flexibility. And what we had to do was record bass and drums together We'd always put the bass and drums down first, having worked out, the chord chart and the song. And then we record that onto the DAT recorder, for example, in stereo. So I'd mix the two drum mics, or the kick drum and the overheads and the bass, into stereo. So that had to be right to start with, because you couldn't undo it afterwards. Then we'd go back to the beginning of the tape. And this is another thing as well. When you are rewinding a piece of tape, it means that you have to think about what you're going to do next. It's very easy at the moment with a computer system to stop recording with one button, press the same button again a fraction of a second later, and you're back at the start ready to go again. So that's a separate thing. Being able to think about what you're going to do next is important. So we play back the DAT that had the bass and the drums on, and we play it back through the mixer, and then set up the other recorder, which was an analog cassette recorder, to record that track, but at the same time as having another track added to it. So I'd mic up a guitar amp and put some rhythm guitar on, or some keyboards or whatever. And all that was fine, and actually it was great fun to do it, because we're listening to the thing building up, which is obviously the case with the computer now, but there was no undo button. And if you'd recorded the first pass, which is bass and drums, then you've done some rhythm guitars, and then gone backwards and forwards, and then decided you didn't like those rhythm guitars, that was it. You were sunk, and there was nothing you could do about it. So the only way you could possibly get around that was to make a safety copy of the first one, but then you'd lose all your other tracks as well. So it really required a lot of thought, a massive thought process. So we had a few mics, a mixing desk. I had a reverb unit at the time, so you had to commit the reverb onto the tape. You couldn't just put it on afterwards on just the guitar, because it had to be all worked out. So the reverb would be recorded in stereo onto another machine while you're playing the part through it, and then you go backwards and forwards all the way to the end, until your final pass. And of course, you would lose quality a little bit every time, especially with the analog machine. So you'd end up with this sort of squeezed sort of top end and more noise and hiss and stuff. But that didn't matter, because the whole process was massive fun. So we had mics, mixing desk, these two machines, a reverb unit, and then a pair of speakers to listen to it through. So modern recording setups usually have that sort of thing. You've got some mics, and you've got a way of getting it onto your computer. So that would be a USB, Firewire, or Thunderbolt, or whatever it is, Lightning adapter into your computer or iOS device if you're using GarageBand, for example. And then all the effects are built in, and then you need your amp and speakers to monitor afterwards. It's always best to record and to mix using a pair of speakers. Try not to do it through headphones. You get a bit of a false impression of the overall space. You can get some good stereo detail, but not so much of the mix, the sort of bare bones of it. So really, all of these, you get lots and lots of plugins on the computer recording workstations, and lots of them are fantastic. They're really good, and they allow you to create even further. But beware of the ones that are there as a corrective tool. For example, denoiser or pitch correction, for example. Be aware of those, because when I was recording with the cassette and the DAT, of course, we had neither. We had neither of those two things, the denoiser. I mean, the tape machine had Dolby on it, but that was, a recording and playback thing. So you couldn't sort of denoise like single end. You couldn't just apply a noise correction to something that was horrible to start with. And of course, analog recording level, you had to think about that as well. Not too high that it introduces distortion, not too low, otherwise the hiss would take over and you all over your recordings. And, you listen to badly recorded albums of the 60s and the 70s, and there's some pretty bad tape hiss there, and that's just incorrect level. And of course, with the digital system, it's far less of an issue. When I say far less, it's still an issue a little bit. You've still got to be careful with your recording levels, but not in the same way as your analog. So, with your plugins, you've just got to decide on the ones that you need. Now, this is important because if you have lots of plugins on a computer-based system, it's going to restrict the number of tracks that you can play back at once, because the plugins are sucking up some of the RAM, some of the processing power, some of the physical memory that's within your computer. So you've got to be very careful with that. Things like reverbs, I tend to do it the old-fashioned way. So instead of putting a reverb on separate channels, I have one reverb unit on a channel somewhere, and I'll use the sends from each channel, because that's how I used to do it. And when I had an 8-track machine, it was a little bit more flexible. Even I had 2 reverb units, no less, and then things like the Zoom Studio, which was a multi-effects unit. But of course, you couldn't store the settings on these things. Apart from the quad reverb that I had, you could store a preset and recall it later. But all of this stuff took time to set up, and that was the disadvantage of it. Of course, you'd want to get a recording done as quickly as possible so that you didn't need to come back to it next day and set everything up again. However, the advantage of the computer-based system, and something you should do, is that you should listen to your recordings in the cold light of day. Sleep on it, come back, have a listen, go, oh, or, ah, yeah, that sounds better than it did yesterday. We're lucky when those situations come. Not very often sometimes. So there it is. There is a little bit of a sort of, I hope, a little bit of a history lesson without saying to the kids, you're lucky we only had this. Because actually I think there's a balance to be struck. And with all these tracks and all these plugins, it's very easy for us to forget what we're recording and the sound that we want to get.